Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Kathleen McLean. I'm the Assistant Curator of Talks and Screenings at the AGO, and I'm really pleased to welcome you all to Art in the Spotlight, Talking Queer Photography. We begin by acknowledging that the AGO is on Mississauga Anishinaabe territory, Mississauga. It's also governed by a treaty between the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Canadian government. The land has also been occupied by other Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat confederacies. A couple of things, housekeeping. Following the conversation, if there is time, there might not be time, we'll take questions, which you can ask using the Q&A feature on Zoom or in the chat on Facebook. And also a thank you to the TD Ready Commitment, our lead sponsor of Talks and Performances, for generously supporting today's talk. Thanks also to Michelle Pearson-Clark for convening this genius group of artists and curators who she's going to introduce in a minute, and to Toronto's Gallery TPW for partnering on this program. So Michelle Pearson-Clark is a Trinidad-born artist, writer, and educator whose work situates grief as a site of possibility for social engagement and political connection. Clark has exhibited in Chicago, Lagos, Los Angeles, and Montreal, and she has forthcoming solo exhibitions at Mercer Union Toronto and the Art Gallery of Hamilton. Based in Toronto, Clark holds an MSW from the University of Toronto, and in 2015, she received her MFA in Documentary Media Studies from Ryerson University. She's currently the inaugural artist in residence at the University of Toronto's Bonham Centre for Sexual Diversity Studies and the photo laureate for the City of Toronto. She kind of does it all. So Michelle, thanks so much for doing this, and please take it away.
Thanks, Kathleen. Good afternoon, everyone. A huge thanks to you, Kathleen, for all of your support, and for the AGO for partnering, with us to present this conversation. And of course, Black people don't blush so much, but it's always a little awkward listening to your bio being read. So thank you for that generous and extensive introduction. I also, before we get going, I'd also really like to thank Noah Bronstein and Gallery TPW for saying yes and working with me to present my first exhibition, We Buy Gold, as well as this event. I also want to thank Dana Seitler and the Bonham Center for hosting me as the inaugural artist in residence. This exhibition is actually a culmination of that residency. Instead of making my own artwork, I've made this exhibition. And I'd also like to thank the Scotiabank Contact Photography Festival, who's our presentation partner for the exhibition. And thank you to all of you for being here. I know 14 months into this pandemic, a lot of us are struggling with Zoom fatigue, and I really appreciate you taking an hour out of your day to join us. And I know for many of us, I'm probably going to get a little emotional. Today's a heavy day. Today's the anniversary of George Floyd's murder. And I know for a lot of us, it has been a day of mourning and memorial and reflection. And so it means a lot on a heavy day to be together and with you. So I just want to acknowledge that. Yeah, my little queer dreams have come true. I'm thrilled to be hosting this conversation. It's part of the public programming. As I mentioned, the exhibition We Buy Gold. It's an exhibition at Gallery TPW here in Toronto, featuring 10 emerging LGBTQ photographers living and working in Canada. We had planned to be physically open by now, but given the ongoing pandemic restrictions here in Ontario, we've had to postpone the opening. And at this point, we're really hoping that we'll be able to get there by late summer and welcome people in to see the work in person. I'm not going to share slides or share images, but to give you an idea of the show, we do have an exhibition website, and Kathleen has dropped that in the chat. So I encourage you to click on that link and have a look at the show if you haven't had a chance to see it yet. So this is my first time curating, and with this show, I've brought together a largely younger generation. I mean, younger than me. Don't let the baby face fool you, I'm 48. So a younger generation of queer and trans photographers who to me seem less interested in just representing queerness and more interested in performing and challenging and interrogating queerness. So I would like to share that the exhibition features the work of Nicholas Aden, Lacey Burning, Seamus Gallagher, Tom Sue, Christopher Lacroix, Wynne Neely and Kyle Lasky on a collaborative project, Isabel Okoro, Michelle Panting, and Brianna Roy. And so I've spent the last 9 months immersed in research, the work of these artists, thinking about queer photography. And I really just wanted to open things up and engage more broadly around some of the things I've been thinking about. And having this conversation for me was a way to do that, and reaching out to folks that, based on their practices, things I've heard them say, things that have been written about their work, to me seem to be thinking about some of these things too. And also it's in line with my current role. As Kathleen mentioned, I'm photo laureate for the City of Toronto. And that role, I serve as an advocate and ambassador for photography and the visual arts. And I work to create a dialogue on contemporary issues. So, you know, in this official role, it's nice to be able to at least virtually welcome some of our panelists to Toronto. And together with my friend and colleague, Sophie Hackett, to be joined in conversation with Jess T. Dugan, Paul Mapaji-Sipuya, and Cam Manstey. I won't read out their entire bios, but by way of brief introduction, let me just say that Sophie Hackett is the AGO's curator of photography, and her areas of specialty include vernacular photographs, photography in relation to queerness, and photography in Canada from the 1960s to the 1990s. Jess T. Dugan is an artist whose work explores issues of identity through photographic portraiture, and is currently the 2020 to 2021 Henry L. and Natalie E. Freund Teaching Fellow at Washington University in St. Louis. Paul Mapaji-Sipuya is a Los Angeles-based artist working in photography and acting associate professor at UC San Diego. And Cam Manstey is an artist, curator, and the associate director of BFA photography at Parsons School of Design in New York City. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for saying yes to this invitation. I do have an ambitious list of questions for us, and we'll see how many we can get through. So just to start us off, during my research for the exhibition, one of the questions I should also add that part of my research during my residency was researching queer photography in terms of pulling together this exhibition, but also because it was my first time curating, I was interested in researching queer curatorial strategies to think about how do I make a queer show as queerly as possible, you know? So in both research on queer curating and queer photography, so thinking about queerness in relation to these two things, one of the questions that comes up over and over is one of definitions. What do we mean by queer? What does it mean, right? So to start us off, and as a way of introduction into your own practices, I wanted to ask each of you what your thoughts are on the term queer photography and how that relates to your own artistic or curatorial practice. Does it resonate for you? Is it expansive? Is it limiting? How do you respond to that phrase, queer photography, in the context of your own work? And I invite anyone to start.
I was trying to give you a chance, Paul, and come in, but since no one's going, I think I'll jump in and break the ice.
Thank you.
So yeah, I love your question, Michelle, and I just wanted to say thank you so much for this invitation, and it's really an honor to be here with all of you, and I'm really excited to jump into this conversation. And Michelle, I love your questions. As you know, I have detailed thoughts about all of them, so we'll see how much we get through. But you know, for me, I guess I just want to start by saying that my photography and my practice is really informed by my own queerness and my own identity. And it always has been. It's always been very directly connected to my identity and my community. But at the same time, I don't want my work to be only defined by queerness. And so I spend a lot of time thinking about what it means to make work as a queer person that honors queer experience, but that then when you put that out into the world isn't reduced or isn't narrowly defined or sort of overly categorized. And so this is a tension that I've had certainly in my practice the whole time. And I think my journey as an artist has really been about balancing these two things, really trying to keep my work highly subjective and personal and honor the parts of it that are innately human. And also put it out in the world and use it as a vehicle for education and advocacy, and to start questions around, to start conversations around identity and gender and sexuality. So it's kind of this back and forth for me. I'm always balancing those two things.
I guess I'll jump in next. Thanks, Jess, for, for breaking the ice. And also, yeah, thank you, Michelle, for bringing us together. This is exciting, to be like talking with you all and, knowing Jess's work for so long and Kama, and we work together in so many ways. So there's already, I think, a strong foundation for this conversation. The question of queer photography is really tricky for me. I'm realizing more and more that my social and political ideals are queer utopia, but realizing that, to be honest with my practice and the core of my work, that sometimes I have to say the work is just gay and is just homoerotic. And so, it's something that I think needs to be spoken of more in terms of work made by gay men. What is it to make work that acknowledges where sort of the formation of desire in the center is, but how there is space for queerness, and also not all of the subjects of my work are queer. And that's been something since the very beginning of my earliest portrait practices. People assumed that everyone was gay. Everyone said gay and bisexual and lesbian. And when I was first making my portraits in 2004, and now it's expanding. But I've acknowledged that the space in which the work is made is queer, that my own position is as a gay cisgendered man who's had various friendships and relationships with queer people, and wanting to be more conscious, especially in the past few years and going forward, for making an inclusive queer space in the practice. So that's where I'm at on this question.
I love that. I'm going to come back to that. Kaman?
Yeah, I want to like, actually, well, let's just jump in. Like what Paul is talking about is like, what's like, yes, it's really important to name all those things and to define those things. And then also like to really unpack what is a queer lens or what is like queer world building, and how to be, sorry for the traffic out in the street, and how to be expansive about thinking about one's queerness as well as one's practice. So those are, I think maybe we should like pin that to like talk about in my work, similar to Jess, like my work has always been informed by my queerness and also trying to like really find what that means. And this sort of, I've always sort of navigated like this sort of sense of trying to understand what does it mean to not have a home to come home to, or what does it mean for this idea of like longing and belonging, and what is place and placelessness. And but it for me, the idea of like queerness and queer world building is more expansive than just like person. And so my work is definitely includes a lot of portraits, but there's also, in my work, there's also a lot of still lives that are also, that I see as really queer, as well as landscapes. So, but yeah, I don't know. Could kick it back to Paul.
I'll let Sophie.
Sure. I mean, well, first of all, thank you. Wonderful to be here. Thank you, Michelle, for including me as part of this stellar group. As we move towards Pride Month and all of what that means. I think, I love the term queer photography. I find it expansive. I find it useful. I've referred back to this definition in other talks. So at the risk of it becoming a bit of a chestnut, I just love this one phrase that is in the introduction of Richard Meyer and Catherine Lord's book, Art and Queer Culture, where they talk about making more sumptuous, the difference between worst fear and best fantasy, which is an allusion to a photograph and a placard actually from a 70s march. but I love this making more sumptuous is a kind of a very, well, it's a juicy phrase. And it's also playful. And I think I'd like to carry that with me. And in my role at the AGO, I'm responsible for the whole history of the medium, which is still short, but getting longer and is wonderfully, I think, messy to deal with. But I think that for me, queer photography is about a sensibility that I bring to the telling of stories. And I think there's an attention to the overlooked in some way. And I think so in that sense, it's no surprise that I'm interested in the vernacular. I'm interested in the modes of photography that have been, I don't know, less validated, less like kind of held up as the most artful or the most powerful or the most affecting in certain ways. So I think I bring that perspective to the work I do.
I think a lot of what I read, queer becomes in the academic sense, right? It becomes a term that means sort of to queer something, right? So as a verb, so addressing power, addressing non-normativity, and moving beyond the bounds of sexuality and gender. So I feel there's a kind of tension around how expansive is this term. We want it to be expansive. It's helpful to be expansive. It resonates for us that it's an expansive term. But then where does that expansion end, right? Like where are the boundaries in terms of like, oh, well, okay, if everything is queer, then what, you know what I mean? Like, it's like, so I see a lot of that sort of trying to be figured out. And this is why it's always coming back to this sense of like, well, what is the definition? Like, what are we talking about? What is under this umbrella? What is outside of that umbrella? So you have the identity of the photographer. You have, to me, what I'm very interested in is the gesture, the photographic gesture, right? The intent of making that photograph, and that the queer sensibility of that to me is the most compelling. And then who is in the work, like Paul is saying, right? Like the assumptions that we make. And to me, a queer photograph doesn't need to include queer or trans people, right? But there is this sort of sense of if we blow it up too much, then we also lose something, right? And like, what do we hold on to that we can agree on, or that makes, not that necessarily we all have to agree on it, but something that makes sense for us in terms of communicating and working. And I love what you had to say, Paul, about sort of coming back to this sense of gay, right? And sort of the position of that. And I think in general, one of the things I came to understand as I worked on this show is that, the work, like everything, the work that our forebears did, the work that our ancestors did to make more space for us allows us to do other things. And as with the expansion, it also now allows for that contraction that, we don't need to include everybody all the time, which we needed to do to make political gains, right? Like we had to band together and we had to bring everybody into the tent. And now there is hopefully more room for us to allow each other and say, no, actually, this is only about gay men, and this is only for gay men, and that's okay, so.
Yeah, I mean, and what I mean by that is not about making exclusive spaces. I think it's about like, I'll relate it to like parties or like clubs, it's like everyone is like queer party night, queer club night. But if you have this queer night and like trans femme are not welcome, what is that like if it's dominated by cisgender people, or it's a space that is dominated by whiteness, whatever? Like, I think because queerness is so big, I found it as just, and this is an interesting thing because we're all teaching as well, like
yes.
Sometimes the term becomes so big. Trauma is another one that's like, so many things are so large that I think it's useful to say what the starting point is. Like, and I realized that as I was making work, it was from a very subjective space of trying to understand a social world that its formation was these kind of like homoerotic, like creative, erotic, collaborative, platonic mix, but that the friends and the people participating in this were not necessarily cisgender gay men. And then as the conversation and my own awareness of queerness and of having, just experiences in the world expanded, I realized I couldn't just adopt the term queer for my work if I was still just making work that was just gay. So now, having understood that, and this is something that one of the reasons why I love doing artist talks and particularly with students is sometimes these students are so much more on top, like I learn from them. And looking back at earlier work I made and having these young people who are so far ahead of the conversation, like respond to it, has made me realize, okay, where do I need to be more inclusive and expansive in order to realize my ideals?
Right.
And, so it's, yeah, I don't want to make work that's just for gay men, but I want to acknowledge that that's my starting point.
Right. No, absolutely. I appreciate that distinction, and yeah, I took that in the wrong direction. But yeah, like I'm working on a project right now, and I read an article online where this one was theorizing dyke camp, and it was like, just that concept of like, a particular, as you're saying, a particular type of sensibility that is queer, but then also the other sensibilities and subjectivities that you move through the world with that are more specific and are more definitive, and that overlap with that in some ways. Yeah. So connected to that, this sense of definition, of course, the other thing that comes up all of the time, the recurrent question, is around representation. And with this exhibition, as I open my curatorial statement by saying questions of visibility and representation have long been queer concerns, tied as they are to hopes and demands for greater acceptance and civil rights. But here I'm trying to look more toward artists who are concerned less with representing queerness, and as I said earlier, and more with performing, challenging, and interrogating it. And Jess, you and I talked about this quite a bit, and you asked me a really good question in our interview for the Strange Fire Collective website. And so we use, in the spirit of bringing that back, I wanted to return to that question and bring it to everybody. So Jess asked me, could you talk about the importance and limitations of visibility, both in the past and in the current moment? So how do you respond to the demands of representation in your own work? How do you see other artists dealing with these demands today?
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in, Michelle. And before I jump into representation, I also just wanted to flag that I love what you said, Paul, about not all of your subjects being queer, because that's true of me too. And I'm always pushing back against the way that the media is writing about the work or presenting the work. It's often so reductive, and I'm often fighting that fight. And so I loved what you said, and Kama, and I loved what you said about queer world building, how that extends beyond practice. And I think those two things really resonated with me. Yeah, in terms of representation, I have a deep belief in the importance of representation. I believe that it's really critical for all people, but in light of this conversation, for queer folks to see images of people who look like us, of people that we can relate to. And I think that images can function as possibility models and can be really important to folks trying to find their path and show them a way that they may not have known as possible. And when I was coming out and when I was younger, I really sought these kind of representations, and they were very powerful to me. Catherine Opie's work is one of the most significant influences to me. I found it as a teenager, and it was hugely important. All of that having been said, I'm at a place in my own work where I'm really interested in moving beyond representation. And I'm no longer interested in this conversation around, this is who I am, this is what my body looks like, this is what my identity is, like I exist, accept me. And that's a perfectly valid conversation. And that's where some of my earlier work has been situated. But at this moment, I'm really thinking about how to make work that's highly subjective, that's talking about just much deeper and more universal experiences through the lens of queerness and through the lens of identity, but not simply representing or illustrating queerness as a means of proving its existence. So I'm trying to just go much more complicated and see what that looks like.
Mm-hmm.
I think as I'm a photo historian, I think about the history of the medium and its kind of long the long thread of it, the long story of it. So to me, I think about it in terms of how visibility and queerness have worked together or not at different moments, and certainly moments in the 60s and 70s where it's clear that simply a picture of queer people existing was, an important that baseline of work needed to be there for the work that now comes next. And we see how this idea has kind of continues to evolve really as people push against it, and at different moments too. Nayland Blake writing in the 1990s is kind of like, oh, those are retrograde aesthetic sensibilities, which seems so harsh a way to think about that generation. But if you think about what comes next, you have to set aside what you have to push against something, right? So I like to me, I'm interested in that push and pull and the evolution of it, and charting it. But I also think it is very, it's so context specific. Here in North America, we have one conversation, but we can think about Zanele Muholi's Faces and Phases project in South Africa at a certain moment where that idea of visibility is still such a huge threat. So I think it's, we have to think about where we are, who's making the work, and in what context, I think and how useful that idea is in any given time and place.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I'm very mindful, absolutely, that in raising questions about representation, that I would never want people to think that I'm dismissive or reductive of what has come before. Like I absolutely, I'm grateful and honor the work that has come before, that has made this just in all ways, right? All the rights that have been won for me, as well as the visual culture rights that have been won for me as an artist, that allow me to live and to make different choices. And that's a great point too, Sophie, about the global inequities in terms of visual culture and visual language, and where our community is at with what images are possible to be produced, what images are possible to be shared. And just in the spirit of thinking about that legacy of work. And also, I think one of the things before I was an artist, I worked in LGBT health promotion. And so working with communities in all kinds of ways, I think this notion of linear progress only has done a lot of damage to us. And there's a lot of assumptions about what lives are like for younger folks, because it's just assumed that progress is ongoing. And certainly that's not the case with many of the artists that I'm working with. In some ways, lots of things have changed. In some ways, the struggles are very similar. But I'm just wondering what you would say is a key queer photographic project or strategy or exhibition that still echoes and reverberates today in the ways that our communities are represented. What are some of those touchstones that you think people should know about or that you return to?
Michelle, I'm gonna quote you in my answer to this question. I love when I was looking at your work and reading your website, I love this quote: "The strength to be vulnerable is a tried and true strategy of queer resistance." And this just hits so, it just rings so true for me. And it's such a succinct way of saying what a lot of my work is about. And I think for me, when I was thinking about this idea about key queer strategies, I really came back to this idea of the power of storytelling and the power of speaking one's truth and the power of being honest about your own experience. And that's something that has been a really significant through line of my practice. And I was also just thinking about how, as queer folks and folks in queer communities, we often have to be really intentional about how we live our lives and construct our identities and how we build our families. And for me, that also overlaps to the way that I make work and to my practice. And then one other thing I was thinking about, also what you were just talking about in terms of visibility, is thinking about what it means to become visible. Certainly, having worked within trans communities rather significantly, there are a lot of gains that come through visibility, but there are also some negative repercussions of that, and thinking through what that means in a safety level and a violence level. But also thinking about what it means as the queer community, or maybe not the queer community, as more mainstream gay and lesbian communities move into this more heteronormative accepted space, I spend a lot of time thinking about what's happening to queerness and queer communities, and you know, what kind of rights we've gained through this visibility, this larger level of visibility, but also what's lost in terms of a more free or intentional way of being in the world. So that's, you know, just something that's on my mind that I think about.
Mhm.
I'm trying to figure out how to respond to both of these questions of the sort of touchstones. I'm so bad at pulling things off the top of my head. I kind of want to turn to my bookshelf and be like, what are all these books that I surround myself by? But maybe one thing to connect it to the other question about visibility is I always have to keep in mind that like my own progress can't be everyone's standard, right? So like at this point, you know, I'm not interested in making work with the end goal of visibility or, in a sense, identity at all. But one of the most beautiful things that happens when work travels is hearing the experiences of people who are encountering these types of images in a place where they have not felt included or seen or visible. And I always have to remember that like, that's a starting point. And so when I was like a teenager, like my introduction just like queer visual culture was scanning like cable TV for like anything that could be used as queer, because it wasn't really queer, but like, you know, it's all in how you use it. It's like, you know, as they say. And then, you know, scouring like magazine stands in Hollywood and like actually finding like just like gay stuff, which was just like in porn magazines. But in that I found art. Like that's how I discovered like, you know, at the time not even realizing like I was discovering like Ron Athey, you know, and then and early internet. And so I feel like I want to always be mindful of the power of representation. And but in the past like 5 or 6 years, I've been interested in making images that where queer things are happening or a queer type of picture is happening, whether or not it's explicit or it's abstract, but that they are also trying to infiltrate a formal or historical conversation on just the medium itself.
Yeah.
So that like there could be like my ideal curatorial project in a certain like in a photo historical way is one that's not about what's in the picture, but how the picture is made.
Yeah.
Because then it forces like a kind of a Black body, like queer type of photography, like having to talk about erotics into a space that's just like form and process. Like that's kind of what I'm interested in, but still, you know, representation is so powerful. There's always going to be new queer children coming up, and we want to like give them something.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I mean, to me, we need both, right? It's like there are those, it's the same thing, like, you know, there are all kinds of complicated, you know, painting projects, and then there are paintings that are just like beautiful to look at, you know, and it's like, for me, in terms of my work, when I think about representation, I think, you know, if I'm trying to tell you something about us, it's like you're also seeing us while I'm trying to tell you that thing, right? So it's sort of those things are intertwined for me, and also just to bump that we put out into the queer universe, Paul's ideal curatorial project. So we'll like manifest that collectively right now and see when that comes to being. And for me, I just want to touch on like in terms of like queer photographic strategy, and this is not something that is just owned by queer communities, but the role of the community photographer. You know, last spring, right before lockdown, I spent 4 days in our local queer archives working on a project that had got canceled due to the pandemic. And there's very little work by artists, right? It's just all of this vernacular photography, all the people who tirelessly documented the prides and documented the softball games and documented the rallies, and many of these photographers have thousands and thousands and thousands of slides in these archives. And not necessarily people who were trained as photographers, but just they had a camera, so they were the one to take the pictures, and that as a strategy of documentation and archiving all types of queer and trans people's lives is something that I think I really felt the luck and the joy of being able to do that, because so many communities don't even have those archives in one place to be able to access, but that body of work that exists in attics and cellars and in all kinds of places, unseen, but just the how that informed my practice was really important.
I just wanted to chime in. Paul, you used a phrase that I really liked. You were scanning the environment for what you could use as queer. And I think that, to me, that is, coming out in the 90s, growing up and that, being formed by that moment, I think that is very much, I relate to that very much. And I think, in thinking about how to answer this question, it's sort of a paltry term in a way, but I will use the word appropriation as a strategy, by which I mean it's almost more an act of interpretation or an act of recasting or an act of claiming something as queer, and it can be a private act, as in I saw that magazine cover, whatever, it's Jodie Foster, it's Katie Lang and Cindy Crawford, and you think, yep, that's for me, whether it was meant that way or not, and that is so, we've kind of built our own image banks in that way. And I think that is such a key queer muscle, for me anyway, and for, I think, our generation, my generation. But so I think I will be curious to hear, someone coming out now, how they would feel, how they think about their image world actually in the same way. But I think that there's so much, great work that's been made that way. There's been so much great, I think, writing and reflection made from that impulse. And so to me, that is, I would want to kind of hang on to that in a sense, because I guess because it's what I know, but it's also, it's generated so much, it's given us much.
Yeah.
And I can think of one example. There's so many works kind of came flooding back to me as I thought about this question, but Nina Levitt's work from 1991, based here in Toronto, she made a work called Submerged for Alice Austin, taking a picture made by Alice Austin and really simply obscuring part of she took that darned club. So, a portrait of two sets of two women, with their arms around each other's waists, a sort of queer gesture maybe, and kind of claimed it as that, whether we knew that or not. The identities are, the declaration of the identities is not there in the same way that we know now. So how can you even do that? But she audaciously took that picture as hers in that work, and kind of in honor of her too.
And I think, I feel like I still flex that muscle, even though I have access to, there's so much upfront and explicitly, as I love that. Yep, that's for me. I like that. So we're gonna put that on a t-shirt. There is so much work that obviously is intentionally queer and, living in a North American context. But there is still something about that image that you run across in whatever context, and you get a little thrill of when you read it as queer or when you claim it as queer, when, that muscle is still something that I think is exciting to flex for sure.
Sophie, you flagged my 15-year-old brain when you said Katie Lang and Cindy Crawford. I haven't thought about that photo in so long, but I was like, oh my God, yes.
I actually got to put it in a show. I borrowed actually from Nina Levitt a copy of that magazine and just put it on the wall of a show, because I was like, there's going to be a bunch of people for whom that's a signal.
Yeah. I personal confession, I recreated that photo with my ex-wife for our local alternative news weekly. So I'll dig that out from the archives and send it to you after. So just to move on a bit, for me, the we in the exhibition title, We by Gold, very much speaks to central ideas of queer collectivity and queer kinship for me. And no matter your artistic goal or intent, I do think that most queer and trans photographers and curators often have to navigate the tensions of working between community and self. So how do these tensions show up for you? How do you address any creative conflicts that may arise? What ethical issues do we need to keep in mind?
Keep trying to hold back to let other people go first, but I'm just going to jump in. Paul and Kamran,
You're my
if you wanna
hero.
go-
You're my
if
hero.
you want to go first, just go. I'm giving you a minute. You know, I think for me, when I was thinking about the idea of community, I was thinking of it in terms of, you know, outside of an art practice. And I think the idea of community is so important to so many queer folks because so many of us don't have our families of origin, or we seek kinship outside of that space. And so community is something I think about a lot. And I'm really grateful to have existed both as an individual and an artist within this larger community space that I'm not sure would exist for me the same way outside of queerness. You know, one thing I was thinking about with this question is how, as a queer artist, and this is certainly true for folks with other kinds of identities that are marginalized, that we often receive this burden or responsibility to speak on behalf of the group. And I think a lot about what that means. And for me in my own practice, I have two very different projects. I have one body of work called Every Breath We Drew that is a highly subjective portrait project looking at identity and queerness, but also at desire and connection and my own identity. And so I really let myself go down a subjective path for that. And then I have another project called To Survive on This Shore, which was more outward looking, more documentary, and that focused on transgender and gender expansive older adults. And so for that work, I really was trying to represent a community more broadly and was thinking a lot about markers of identity and the ways in which I sometimes did share an identity with the subjects, but many times did not. You know, I was crossing lines around race and ethnicity and gender identity and expression and age, you know, rather significantly, and socioeconomic class. And so I think for me, the way I think about working within community is different for different kinds of projects. But I think at the end of the day, I feel a very strong ethical responsibility. I have a very, you know, clear set of ethical guidelines for myself about how I represent people. And for me, it centers around representing people with dignity and respect, and really constantly working to understand my own identity and my own motivations for making that work, particularly within when it's within a very specific community.
Do you want to go next, Kaman? Or should I?
Sure, I'll go. I mean, I think like, you know, this, in my opinion, this one of the central tenets of you know, thinking about how to be as a person, but also even as a queer artist is community and care. Like those two things are so central. And so in the communities that you build over time, and you know, thinking about how to care for one another, how to hold space for one another, how to support each other, that's, you know, whether or not an art practice or studio practice exists, like that's sort of the foundation of being and being in relation. And then in terms of making work or even curating work, that's, you know, that's always the first two. And, you know, to curate, and I've been lucky to, you know, curate a couple of shows. To curate is to care for, right? And that's sort of the root word as well. That, you know, that process is also dialogical. You know, it has to come from conversation and pushing and questioning and the sort of back and forth and trying to build something together. While if we're trying to make a portrait, how do we build this image together? If we're working on a show, how do we build a group show together? So those are the things that I, you know, think about as both an artist, an educator, and a curator.
Yeah, that this idea of care is so important. And I think particularly because we all work in photography, it's medium that's all about reproduction and dissemination of images, that like the care has to extend into how they go out into the world. I try to, as much as possible, check in with friends, especially when older work that may not have been seen before. You know, we know how it is. You make work for years, and there's bodies of work that may take a long time to get seen. We might relate to it differently, you know. So I appreciate that the way in which work keeps this ongoing conversation, like you said, Kaman, it's like dialogical. So I think about that, and then I think about like what also Sophie mentioned, the like Katie Lang and Cindy Crawford. Like then there's the community of viewers.
Yes.
You know, it's like, and there's this book, I think it's by Thomas Waugh. It's just like a history of the homoerotic photograph, but he talks about like at a moment when, you know, it was mostly illegal and people were, you know, illicitly getting images in the mail or through these photo sharing societies, that like community wasn't like people able to gather in a place or even know each other's names. It was people who all might recognize and respond to the same image because they'd been on the receiving end. And that like photography itself is a medium that like the moment we pick it up presupposes a whole chain of a networking community of people who will receive it. So it's like, we don't even need to know who they are. So that's kind of the community I'm interested in. I never made parameters around who was going to be in my portraits or in the other images other than we knew each other or wanted to get to know each other. There was never like, this is Brooklyn queer people in the aughts, you know. It was just like, these are my friends. The only thing I could be accountable to is just like, we wanted to get to know each other. But then I realized as time passes, the work becomes it becomes a documentary of a certain kind.
Yes.
And then new responsibilities come with that. So I don't know if there's an answer in like, one can set up a project and then know all of these things. It's just about, like, as Kaman says, like it being ongoing and dialogical. Like we always have to return to the work and figure out what responsibilities we have and then put it out there and then see how it went and then make, you know, adjust our considerations and things.
And I just think all of those notions that you've raised, accountability, care, responsibilities, relationships, like all of those things to me are so intertwined. And I think it's, you know, it is different when you know, I mean, not right now, but I think it is different when you're working within a community, making images where if people are hurt, if you cause harm, if people are upset, you see them, right? You know, this is not the intimacy and the distance between who we are working with, who we are working alongside, and who is going to have a response to our work and who it matters to. Those distances are very small, right?
One thing else I've learned over the years is like being able to face the places where I've made huge mistakes or had like total blind spots, like returning to a lot of earlier work, realizing that I picked up my camera with a goal to look at something in a certain way and ask certain questions. And that at times having made me unaware of what a friend was going through. And so how looking back at a picture might return to a difficult point in someone's life, or it becomes associated in ways in which I didn't understand in time. So part of this conversation is about that, because I think we receive these pictures as particularly representative portraits as being you know, this promise of photography, like it's the essence of a person or something. You know, I let that go a long time ago, but I'm always like wanting to think of first as like, what did the photographer want from this, and why? So why is this image the way it is? And that it's just so much more complicated. So I have ideals, and then I learn a lot from the places where I've made mistakes in the past.
Yeah.
like Paul, what you're talking about is also like learning through time, like learning from the work and how an image can exist. And because it exists through time and in relationships with people over time, that we can keep learning from it. We may like want a certain image and then make a certain image. And then when you get it back from the lab or you're scanning or you're like looking, you know, there's that one moment, but then it's generous. Like photography can be really, well, photography can be really violent and extractive and take. But then there's also this moment where it can be, it has a longer, you know, it's smarter than you, it has a longer shelf life than you. And through time, we learn all these other things. So that's something really like beautiful that you're talking about, Paul, and how like we can be reflexive with our work, even if it's a picture from 20 years ago. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned working in portraiture and, you know, building on our discussion of both representation and collectivity. I do want to talk about that. I came across a lot of portraiture in my research for the show. There is quite a bit of portraiture in the show, and all three of you make portraits as well. So I'm just wondering your thoughts. How are queer and trans photographers contributing to the evolution of portrait photography? And what does portraiture currently have to offer to the visualization of our communities?
I've always been drawn to portraiture. I sometimes joke that I've had, you know, tunnel vision on portraiture since I started. It's just been a complete obsession, and it was the thing I jumped right into as a young person. I am making some still lifes now, so I might have to change how I talk about my work. But, you know, for me, I was always drawn to portraiture because it's just such a powerful way to talk about identity and the human experience. And it was a very visceral attraction to me. I love what Paul said about, you know, you wanting your work to be situated in a larger art historical conversation and dialogue with other work. And that's something that I'm really interested in too. I love in like a museum space or a curatorial space when my work is embraced primarily as portraiture, not as queer or not as photography. And when it's used to be part of this larger conversation. And I think for me, you know, one of my primary strategies around making portraits is that I try to create a space with the person that I'm photographing where a very genuine emotional or psychological moment or a moment of connection can happen. And then in an exhibition space, I obviously replace myself with a viewer. And I want to put that viewer in a space of intimacy with someone who might be queer, someone who might be trans. I want that viewer to be across the kitchen table from the person they're looking at, to be across the bed from them, to be activated by that gaze, and to really have to think through that activation about what kind of assumptions they're making, or what kind of feelings they're having, or what kind of thoughts they're having. I want them to be on the receiving end of that intense gaze that I've created, and reflect on themselves through that experience. And for some people that may be, you know, validating and meaningful. For some people that may be uncomfortable, but I want the space of the portrait to be both intimate, but also very active for the viewer.
Mm.
I want to say, Michelle, that I love, I'm just going to do a shout out to one of the artists in your show. I love Tom Sue's works, and not all of the works in the show are portraits, and not all of, you know, Tom's still lives are wild and so erotic and, you know, full, like just so sensuous and just lovely to look at. And I think Tom's example, I've only looked at the work and I've never met Tom, but is an example of something of like a new queer strategy, right? Like in, you know, the in looking back at all, like Jess and Paul, or even like the work I was making like early on, like there was stuff where I craved that reflection of maybe myself or my community, and there was all those sort of the things that were missing and the occlusions, right? The epistemic violence. But then when I'm looking at Tom's work, I'm just so excited that there's like a new like way of looking, and a sort of a queerness and like these sort of queer signifiers. And so it makes me think about, and this is something I've thought about a lot, and even in my own curatorial projects, is like, what if queer artists didn't have to spend all of our time and mental and emotional energy saying, we exist,
Exactly. Yeah.
we're here. And unlearning fear and shame and guilt and all that stuff. And if we had a queer blueprint, then you could make this kind of work, and get to it, get to it faster. So that was when I was like looking through all the amazing work from all the 10 artists. It was Tom's work that really just like made me jump out of my seat. So I just wanted to give a shout out to.
If you had told me I would put a photograph of 2 bananas in an exhibition, I would not have believed you. But yeah, I think Tom's work is a good example of different questions about portraiture, and I see portraiture in some of his photographs where there aren't people as well, and it's the way he works. He has a vast archive of images, and he always exhibits like a lot of images together, and it's that collective impact of seeing all those images together. But also, Paul, in your work, in a lot of ways, I think your work is more about photography than it is about anything else. I find your work asks me a lot of questions and shows me a lot of things and makes me think about portraiture. Yes, there are queer and other identities of people helping you illustrate and helping you bring those questions to us as the viewer, but questions of how that photograph is made, who is making it, and why. Exactly that question you said before. What does this photographer want? Because for so long, we know that the history of photography is the power dynamics, are primarily extractive. And I think for me, as I was doing research for this show and in all of your practices, and even thinking back, Sophie, to walking through, the 2 major exhibitions you did here in Toronto for World Pride in 2014, that to me is what I see in terms of portrait photography and what the queer or trans gaze contributes or is helping us to think more about is how is that portrait made, because I think for a lot of viewers, it's the person that you're looking at, it's the portrait, and the person behind the camera kind of is not part of that equation, and for me with queer and trans photographers, that person is always present, that person is always part of the equation, they're in the room with me.
Yeah, so okay, and I'm like thinking this through as I'm speaking. Because initially you were asking about our current thoughts on on specifically portraiture, right? And so one of the wildest things I would have just never imagined that we would be in a space or like at a moment where 10 years ago, I could not have imagined that there would be such a desire for the seeing and the consumption of work by queer, trans, people of color. I think when I was first making work, I was really uncomfortable as a undergrad and recently afterwards in early 2000s, because it felt like you had to really exile yourself to a whole other art world conversation, and only it's taken a long time to I think do what you said has really stood out to you, Michelle, which is make work about photography. And so right now I'm kind of concerned about too many people relying solely on making beautiful pictures of queer people as the end goal, and not about which is very gratifying. I'm just it's just washing over me, the amount of beauty, and it's just so stylish and it's so seductive, it's sumptuous, that word, right? But I am a little bit concerned about that being an end goal. And then the last thing I wanted to say about it is there's something with the mirror images that I've been making that's actually about excluding people, but formally, but realizing that through recognition of either the subject or something that's happening in the image, that's a way to enter into a queer space, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Queer people know how to get in, or something always comes back to me, something that I've mentioned in other artist talks, like when I did this project at the Studio Museum years ago, and it was just all these portraits of like boys that I knew, all these friends. There was no regard to race at all. I was like interested in just like showing like, I was just like, what would happen if I did this at a place where everyone expects every subject to be Black, and then that's how we understand the work going forward. But it was, you know, and I got this email from a woman from Berlin who's an art historian, and she said she had never been to she had never seen my work before and walked into this show. She didn't know it was going to be there ahead of time, and was like, what is going on? Why are all these people here? Like, what am I supposed to be looking at? Sorry, there's motorcycles going by. But then, you know, and she said like, she was walking through and then she recognized someone who was this, she's from Berlin, a friend of mine from Berlin, worked at Berghain for years. And every time she went, she would hand him her coat. And so she like suddenly knew like from this kind of like, from that recognition of Gunnar moving through the space, she was like, oh, now I know how to navigate the rest of this portraiture, right? Mm-hmm. So sometimes it's like, so for me, even though it's not about like whether or not every subject is queer or none of the work is explicitly identifying an aspect of any of my subjects' gender or race or sexual orientation, that the reason why they're all in the space is something queer, even if we can't see it at the center. It's like if you walked into a dinner party and you're like, why are these people here? It's like, oh, the host is a big old homo. And like, we're gonna have everyone here, but like there's one reason why we're in the room together. So that's like my three kind of pillars right now on portraiture. It's like, why are we all in the room? How do you find your way in when the structure kind of like asks you to divert towards like your own sort of like social navigation of the world, and then like trying to get past just beautiful, stylish pictures of people as the end goal. Yeah.
So much to say, but we're at 5:03, so I'm just mindful of people's time. I'm just going to jump ahead and squeeze in one last question to end with it looking ahead. So if you all can give us 5 more minutes. So coming back to you, Paul, actually, in an interview with The Guardian last year, your work is described as a reaction to the gay photography you saw growing up. And in that interview, you said, I think it just came out of frustration. There's something very limiting in those, I'll call it capital G, gay photo circles where the conversation never gets past desire. So looking ahead, I just would love to hear from everyone. Where does the conversation need to go? What are the subjects that still need to be addressed in queer and trans photographic practices? What haven't we seen yet?
I loved hearing this question directed at Paul, because it reminded me of, again, like my 16-year-old self and seeking out these images, and just, I remember finding these like postcard racks with just like totally reductive, like highly sexual, beefy gay men, you know, like that's like what was available. And, you know, I think, yeah, for me, that early seeking of imagery was really important, but what I found was not as complicated as what I wanted. And I think for me, you know, I'm really interested in the idea of desire in my work. It's a really core tenet of my work. But for me, I'm interested in looking at a much more complicated version, thinking about, you know, the ways in which desire is intertwined with identity, but also thinking about desire as a means of connection, you know, beyond a sort of sexual desire or beyond a specific kind of romantic attraction. And then also thinking about desire as this multifaceted thing, like a desire to be something or to be near something or to become something. So, you know, I'm not so interested in this very reductive kind of straightforward sexual desire, but I am deeply interested in desire and how it functions, and also how, as queer people, we often have our identities validated through desire and through a reflection of that desire or having that desire met. So that was one thing I thought. And you know, the other thing I thought about this question is thinking about specifically representations of transness, and for so long how those have focused only on you know, the body or physical transition. And I'm really interested to see what the next generation of queer and trans artists is going to make and create. And I'm hoping that, and I'm already seeing it certainly in artists, kind of the next stage coming up after me. But I'm really interested to see how representations of transness or gender expansiveness become more nuanced and more complicated. And hopefully younger artists or artists of the next generation don't feel some of the same burdens that have been placed on contemporary artists or the artists who came before us.
Anyone else? Where does the conversation still need to go?
I think I can just say quickly that I work inside a large institution, and for me, there are some of the ways that we're working that are still in terms of building our collections. For instance, we've done some exhibitions. We think about. I'm able to think about. Queerness as a topic among many, and I think this has been back to Paul's point about how there's been such a shift in recent years. I feel like I see that even inside my own institution. I think what I'm keen to think about in terms of curatorial work is thinking about new queer ways of working, or collaborative ways of working. How can we integrate that, bring that inside, up into the institution, encourage it to kind of take root in its own way inside the institution? Of course, that's in the context of lots of other work around equity and inclusion, but to me, that's not so distinct. It sounds very process-based and infrastructure institution-based, but I think it's not so separate from thinking about the artwork somehow, and is there a way to sort of bring those things closer together? So I feel somehow that's in the back of my mind always.
Any last thoughts, Paul or Kaman?
Oh, you can go, come on.
Oh, I like, not to be contrarian to what Sophie just said, because I do agree, and I also work in an institution. And don't mind when I'm collected in one, but at the same time, I think I'm more interested in work and working and artists working in a way that isn't in the bounds of institution, and that isn't hierarchical, isn't about asking to be included. And it's a much more non-hierarchical, mutual way of working that can be horizontal, it can be porous, it can be messy. That's what I'm interested in, artists that are working that way. I'm interested in my students and the younger artists that we work with all the time that are doing and making together. And I think that's just that's what I'm excited about. And I also want to just quote a friend who's an artist and curator, Ephraim Zaloni Mendel, just thinking about what people have been talking about in the body and what Jess was talking about, the body, and thinking about and what Paul said too, and the caution is like, the body gets in the way, and there's also desire beyond the body of desire to build or build a new world or dismantle the current existing world together, that sort of queer utopia that even Paul was talking about at the beginning. So those are the things I'm thinking about, but I'll pass it to you, Paul.
Yeah, everyone has had such, I'm not sure even what I can add on top of what's been said, but because sometimes I think that I don't even know how to describe the thing that hasn't arrived yet, or what's like, it's just gonna surprise us. And that's what I'm most excited for like seeing something and I'm like, wait, is that queer? Like I want like to see work where I'm brought back to that thing where I'm like, oh wow, this is like moving through all kinds of unpredictable places, and maybe it's queer, maybe I'm wrong. Like maybe it's just like catfishing us. Like I think that could be the queer thing. Yeah.
That's
I'm
good. Yeah, you don't have to have. I'm fine with the uncertainty. I'm happy with that. Yeah.
Yeah, and then like the question that the interview that prompted that question, Michelle, was like, I was talking about being in this like the downtown New York zine world and making like pictures of like mostly cute young gay guys, and realizing I had deeper questions than just the like realizing that like these early projects that I was featured in, realizing like people are just selecting the work based on what they think, who they think is attractive. I was like, this is, and I'm such a Scorpio, like you tell me what to do and I'm gonna do I'm like gonna refuse to do it. So I just stopped making portraits for a few years. This isn't work that many people have seen, but I had to just like completely move in another direction until like, I'm always gonna say like desire and kind of placing sexual desire as the starting point, regardless of anything else, is going to be at the center of my work. But it took me a long time to figure out how to come back to that in a way that could get more complicated. But again,
Right.
I couldn't sit down and write out a game plan for it or a thesis. It just, like the new queer work that I hope to see, like, I don't know, like it just emerged after working in a lot of failure and a lot of starts and stops and just pushing forward. So I
Yeah.
just hope people just keep making work, and like I just want to keep learning from everyone else's work going forward.
Yeah, no, I feel very lucky. And, being an artist, this is the second half of my life. So, I have, I'm sort of in this hybrid position of working and being and in shows with lots of younger artists. And I feel very lucky, it's very exciting to be their peer and to sort of be able to engage with them. And now as a curator. So, yeah. Well, that brings us to the close. Thank you so much for joining me for this conversation. So much to think about. We could have gone on, but I do really think Zoom needs to be limited for everybody's capacities. And so I hope, I look forward to seeing what's coming out next for the rest of this year and going forward. Wishing you all good health as we hopefully collectively move through this last phase, hopefully, or the last phase of this version of this pandemic. And to everybody else in our audience, thank you for being here. If you're in Toronto, we will have a show at some point. And everybody else, thanks for joining us. Thanks for your attention. And yeah, have a good evening. Bye.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks,
Bye.
Michelle.
Thank you.
You all.
Bye.